It was about understanding why she was here in the first place. The cold chill in the room seemed to grow stronger. There was a shift in the atmosphere. Kara couldn't explain it, but everything felt different now. As if the room itself had become a trap. She closed her eyes, trying to focus. Trying to think of a way out. Her mind was racing, but the more she thought, the more the weight of the situation pressed down on her. She had to get free. Had to find a way to fight back. And she had to do it before Thomas made his next move. Before she became a pawn in whatever twisted game he had in mind. The moment she opened her eyes, she knew, this was just the beginning. Kara's heart raced, the adrenaline coursing through her veins as she struggled against the restraints binding her to the coffee table. She refused to let herself become a passive victim. There was too much at stake, and she wasn't going to let Thomas, or anyone, control her fate. Her eyes flicked around the room, trying to map out her surroundings once more. The low hum of the lights in the room seemed to mock her attempts to think clearly, and the distant sound of Reggie's strained breathing only served to amplify the sense of helplessness that was rapidly sinking into her chest. But no. She wasn't helpless. Her thoughts snapped back to the Christmas card, no, the envelope, she had received earlier. It had felt wrong. Something about it hadn't added up, and now she was paying the price for letting her guard down. For trusting someone like Thomas. Reggie's voice broke her thoughts. It was more desperate now, but there was a new edge to it. A determination she hadn't heard before. Just tell me what you want. Reggie shouted, his voice strained with frustration. What is this all for? Kara's eyes flicked toward the figure in the dark corner of the room. Thomas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood there, his silhouette barely visible against the dim light, his face still obscured by the shadows. The silence stretched for an agonizing few moments. Then, slowly, he took a step forward. His footsteps were eerily calm, too deliberate. I want to test your resolve, Thomas said, his voice low but chilling. I want to see how far you'll go to protect her. Kara's heart thudded in her chest. She didn't understand what he was talking about. Why her? What did she have that he wanted? The questions swirled in her mind like a storm, but she couldn't focus on them. She had to think, had to find a way to fight back, to protect Reggie and herself. Leave her out of this, Reggie said, his voice a little steadier now, but still trembling with a barely contained fury. You don't have to do this. Whatever you want, we can give it to you. Just let her go. Thomas stopped, standing still for a long moment. It was as though he was contemplating Reggie's words, weighing them. Then, without warning, he threw back his head and laughed. A cold, unsettling laugh that seemed to reverberate off the walls. You really think you can bargain with me, he sneered. You think offering me something will make this easier for you? It's too late for that. Kara's stomach tightened. The way he spoke, the contempt in his voice, made her blood run cold. There was something terrifyingly dispassionate about the way he was handling the situation. He didn't seem to care about their fear. It was as if he enjoyed it. Kara's mind spun with options, but none of them seemed feasible. The room was too small for a clean escape, and the restraints on her wrists felt unyielding. She needed a distraction. Something to give her a chance to fight back. But then, something clicked. Reggie. He was still talking, still trying to make sense of it all. His words were filled with confusion, but beneath that, Kara could hear the subtle shift in his tone. There was a change in him. He was figuring it out. And she was going to use that. Her gaze flicked toward Reggie, her silent partner in this fight. She could see the fire in his eyes, the determination growing stronger with each passing second. She wasn't sure how, but she knew that together, they could get through this. Thomas, still lurking in the shadows, seemed to sense the shift. He looked at Reggie, his eyes narrowing. You think you can outsmart me? He asked, the derision in his voice rising. You think you're in control of this situation? Reggie straightened, taking a deep breath. I'm not trying to outsmart you. I'm trying to survive, just like you are. Kara saw the faintest flicker of something in Thomas's eyes, perhaps it was doubt, or maybe just anger, but it was enough to give her hope. Reggie was drawing Thomas out, distracting him with his words. That was her opening. As Thomas took a step toward Reggie, Kara shifted her focus. Her wrists were still bound to the coffee table, but she could feel the pressure loosening ever so slightly. The knots were tight, but not impossible to work with. She took a deep, steadying breath, her pulse quickening. This was her chance. Reggie was still speaking, trying to stall Thomas. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with fear and defiance. Kara concentrated on the knot, her fingers trembling but determined. She twisted her wrists in the ropes, then tugged, slowly, cautiously, until she felt the ropes give way. Her heart skipped a beat. She was free. But the moment was fleeting. Thomas's eyes flicked toward her just as she pulled her hand free from the knot. He was quick, too quick. But Kara was faster. Before he could react, Kara grabbed the lamp off the coffee table and swung it with all her might. The hard porcelain collided with his face, and he staggered back, stunned by the blow. Reggie! Kara shouted. Now! Reggie didn't hesitate. He lunged at Thomas, his hands grabbing for whatever he could, grabbing the nearest object, anything that could be used as a weapon. The two of them collided, a blur of motion and desperation. Thomas, however, was no ordinary man. He was quick and strong. He kicked out, sending Reggie sprawling across the room. But Kara wasn't finished. She grabbed a nearby vase and hurled it at Thomas, hitting him square in the chest. He grunted in pain, but his smirk never wavered. You really think you can stop me? He hissed, his eyes burning with malice. Kara's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The room seemed to shrink as the tension between them reached a boiling point. Kara's mind was racing, her instincts kicking in, urging her to stay calm despite the chaos unfolding around her. Reggie was back on his feet, but the struggle between him and Thomas had only just begun. Kara's heart was pounding in her chest as she searched for anything else she could use to defend herself and Reggie. Thomas was bleeding now, a trickle of blood running down his forehead from the impact of the lamp, but the twisted smile on his face remained unchanged. If anything, it only deepened, as if he were savoring every moment of this fight. Come on, then, he sneered, wiping the blood from his brow with the back of his hand. Is that all you've got? Reggie, furious and desperate, lunged again, this time with a broken chair leg in hand. He swung it at Thomas with all his might, but Thomas was fast. He sidestepped, catching Reggie's wrist mid-swing and twisting it violently. Reggie cried out in pain, his grip on the chair leg slipping as Thomas forced him to the floor. Kara's breath caught in her throat. She had to do something. She couldn't just watch as Reggie fought for his life. She scanned the room again, her eyes landing on the kitchen knives. They gleamed under the faint glow of the room's lights. She couldn't hesitate, if she did, it could cost them both their lives. Without thinking, she scrambled to her feet, ignoring the pain in her wrists from the restraints she had just broken. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but her determination was sharper than any physical weakness. Kara grabbed the closest knife, its cold steel a comforting weight in her hand. She moved as silently as she could, praying Thomas wouldn't notice her. The last thing they needed was for him to turn his attention toward her. But as she got closer, her foot slipped on a broken piece of furniture, sending a loud crash echoing through the room. Thomas's head snapped in her direction, his eyes blazing with fury. You, Thomas growled, but Kara didn't give him the chance to finish. She charged forward, swinging the knife in a swift arc toward his chest. Thomas caught her arm mid-swing, the blade just grazing his shoulder. His grip on her wrist was like iron, and his twisted smile widened as he twisted her arm behind her back, forcing her to the ground. "You think you can defeat me?" he spat, his breath hot on her ear. Kara's heart raced as she struggled, trying to break free from his iron grip. Her mind was clouded with panic, but she couldn't let him win. Not like this. Suddenly, Reggie's voice cut through the air, full of rage and determination. "Kara, get up. He's not invincible." Kara didn't have time to think. With all the strength she could muster, she drove her elbow back into Thomas's side, catching him off guard. His grip loosened just enough for her to break free. She rolled to the side, gasping for breath. Reggie was up again, his eyes wild with anger. His earlier pain was forgotten as adrenaline took over, and he charged at Thomas once more. This time, they weren't fighting for their lives individually. They were fighting for each other. Together, they might stand a chance. Reggie tackled Thomas, knocking him to the ground, but Thomas was relentless. He twisted, attempting to throw Reggie off, but Reggie was relentless in turn. Kara watched, her chest tight with fear and anticipation, knowing that this moment would decide everything. Reggie's hands found Thomas's throat, and for a brief moment, it looked as though he might actually choke the life out of him. But Thomas was too strong, and with a violent twist of his body, he threw Reggie off once more. Kara's heart sank as she saw Thomas rise to his feet again, looking more dangerous than ever. But then, in that moment of uncertainty, something shifted. Reggie, panting and bruised, reached out and grabbed the chair leg again. With renewed determination, Reggie swung it at Thomas's legs, knocking him off balance. Thomas stumbled, falling backward into a stack of boxes near the wall. He grunted, the sound of his head slamming into the ground echoing through the room. Kara watched as Thomas lay still for a moment, the room heavy with silence. Was he out? Was it over? Reggie moved cautiously toward Thomas, wary of another attack, but the silence lingered too long. Kara's gut told her not to trust it. She didn't dare take her eyes off him. Suddenly, Thomas lunged forward with unexpected speed, grabbing Reggie's ankle and pulling him down. Reggie yelled in pain, trying to break free, but Thomas had the advantage. He was too fast. Kara couldn't hesitate this time. She grabbed another knife from the counter, holding it tightly in both hands. She didn't wait. She rushed at Thomas, driving the blade toward him. The knife sank into Thomas's arm, the shock of the impact causing him to scream in pain. He loosened his grip on Reggie, who scrambled away, finally free. Kara stood over him, her chest heaving as she fought to catch her breath. Thomas was no longer the man he had been when he first arrived. His eyes were wild, filled with rage and pain, but it was clear, he wasn't the one in control anymore. With a final scream of frustration, Thomas collapsed onto the floor, his body still. Kara and Reggie stood over him, breathing heavily, eyes locked on the man who had terrorized them both. They didn't move for a long moment, as if waiting for him to spring to life. But he didn't. It was over. Kara's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly backed away from Thomas's still form. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. For a moment, everything around them stood still. The only sounds were the ragged breaths of Kara and Reggie, the distant hum of the holiday lights that still flickered on the mantel, and the unsettling silence that had replaced the chaos. Reggie's hand trembled as he wiped blood from his lip. His eyes never left Thomas, watching for any signs of movement. He was waiting for the moment when the killer might rise again, but Thomas remained motionless, sprawled on the floor. Kara's grip on the knife tightened, the cold metal a harsh reminder of the violence that had unfolded over the past hours. Her mind was a whirl of confusion, relief, and exhaustion. Was it truly over? Could they finally be safe? As if answering her thoughts, a soft creaking sound came from the hallway outside the room. Kara's breath hitched, and she whirled around, her eyes scanning the dark corridor. Reggie was instantly by her side, his posture tense, ready to spring into action. "Who's there?" Kara called, her voice trembling despite the force behind it. The silence stretched, and for a split second, Kara thought her mind was playing tricks on her. But then, a low chuckle echoed from the hallway. It wasn't Thomas. Reggie's eyes darted to Kara's, his expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. The sound came again, a soft, mocking chuckle that sent a chill through their spines. "Not so easy, huh?" the voice taunted from the hallway. It was low, cold, but unmistakably familiar. The blood drained from Kara's face. She knew that voice. "Jason," she whispered under her breath. Jason, the man she had called a friend, the man who had been invited into her home, the one she trusted. But now, he was a threat. He stepped into view, standing in the doorway, his face hidden in shadow, but the unmistakable glint of a gun in his hand gave him away. He held it with practiced ease, a deadly certainty in his stance. "How nice of you to welcome me to the party," Jason sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Kara's breath caught in her throat. "What do you want?" she demanded, taking a step back, trying to put more distance between herself and the gun. Her grip on the knife tightened, but she knew it wouldn't help much against a weapon. "I think you know what I want," Jason said coolly. He stepped forward, the barrel of the gun gleaming in the dim light. "I always get what I want." Kara's mind raced. Why had Jason done this? She'd never seen this side of him before. He'd always been the charming, easygoing friend, the one who showed up at parties and offered a helping hand when needed. But now he was a threat. "I don't want any more trouble," Reggie said, his voice calm but firm. "We've had enough of this madness." Jason's eyes flickered toward him, sizing him up. "You should have stayed out of it," he sneered. "But now, it's too late." Reggie stepped forward, keeping his body between Kara and Jason. "No more bloodshed," Reggie said, his voice hard as steel. "Put the gun down, and let's talk this out." Jason scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "Talk? You think I care about talking?" The tension in the room thickened with each passing second. The gun in Jason's hand seemed to grow heavier, and Kara's pulse raced as the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to act, to do something before Jason could make his move. But Reggie's voice cut through her panic, steady and calm. "This ends now." Jason's gaze flickered toward the broken body of Thomas on the floor, and something dark flashed in his eyes. "This isn't over," he muttered. "Not until I say it is." Kara could see it in his eyes, a hunger for control. A need to dominate. But Reggie wasn't backing down. He was ready to fight, to do whatever it took to protect Kara and end this nightmare once and for all. Without warning, Reggie lunged forward, knocking Jason off balance. The gun went off, a deafening sound that sent shockwaves through Kara's ears. But it didn't hit anyone. It went wild, the bullet lodging into the wall behind them. Kara screamed as Jason struggled to regain control, but Reggie's weight on him made it impossible. Kara grabbed the knife again, her hands trembling, but she knew this was it, she had to end it. In a flash, Kara moved behind Jason, her knife raised high. She didn't hesitate. She drove the blade into Jason's shoulder, feeling the sickening thud as it hit flesh. Jason howled in pain, dropping the gun as his body jerked from the force of the blow. Reggie took the opportunity to knock Jason to the ground. The gun skidded across the floor, and Kara quickly kicked it out of reach. She stood over Jason, breathing heavily, her body still buzzing with adrenaline. "Stay down," Reggie warned, his voice low and menacing. Jason's breath was labored, his eyes wide with shock. He didn't move. He couldn't. The two of them stood there for a moment, watching the man who had once been a friend, now an enemy. The room was eerily silent except for the sound of their breathing. The nightmare had gone from bad to worse, but now, with Jason incapacitated and no more threats looming, they were finally able to breathe. Kara stood over Jason, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and anger. This man, the one who had been her friend, had turned into something unrecognizable. Her thoughts raced as she processed everything that had just happened, the near-death experience, the betrayal, the terror of not knowing if they would make it out alive. But in that moment, as the adrenaline slowly ebbed away and exhaustion began to settle in, Kara realized something else: she had survived. They had survived. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The police were finally on their way. Kara didn't know how long it would take them to reach the house, but she was ready for it. She turned to Reggie, her eyes meeting his in a silent exchange of relief. Reggie was already on his phone, speaking with the authorities. "It's over," he said, his voice barely audible over the line. "We're safe now." Kara let out a shaky breath, finally feeling the weight of everything begin to lift. It was over. They were free. Minutes later, the police arrived, and Kara watched as they took Jason into custody. The house that had been a prison just hours ago was now a place of temporary safety. Kara knew that, in time, the fear would fade, but the memories would remain. It would take time to heal, to move on from what had happened. But for now, she was alive. And that was all that mattered. Days later, Kara sat in the quiet of her living room, her hands wrapped around a cup of warm tea. The house had been cleaned, the police investigation was over, and life was beginning to return to normal, at least on the surface. But the events of that night lingered in her mind. She still couldn't shake the image of Thomas's twisted face, or the sound of Jason's voice as he threatened them. Still, Kara found herself grateful for the strength she had discovered in herself. She was no longer the woman who had invited strangers into her home without a second thought. She had learned the hard way what it meant to trust, and to survive. Reggie came into the room, his expression soft. "How are you holding up?" he asked, sitting beside her. Kara offered him a small, weary smile. "I'm okay," she said quietly. "We're okay." And that was enough, for now. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more thrilling tales. Don't forget to check out the other videos on the screen now, you won't want to miss what's coming next.